Okay, we are going to move on now with Vivaldi during the Baroque period. We spoke about Corelli when I last saw you, and I would strongly suggest that everybody re-listen to the Corelli Trio Sonata that we spoke about in class, just so you can keep it fresh in your mind. You won't be tested on it, but we're starting to move into familiar territory with respect to the sounds you're hearing. And this is kind of a good basis. So it's a 3-minute, 4-minute piece. Please take the time to listen to it all again and remember kinds of things that we talked about. Individual movements, in this case, a stately introduction, then a fast movement with all the imitation between the violins, slow expressive second movement or third movement, and then the last movement in binary form. And to remember that one of the guiding principles of the Baroque period are these outer voices, this melodic material in the upper voices, and then a bass line that is kind of driving the action. And is basically set up typically by this continuo section of a cellist, for example, and a harpsichord player or a keyboard. Some instrument that fills out the chords, in other words. Okay, so we're moving on to Vivaldi. So we're going to talk for the Baroque period, basically, after Corelli, about 3 major composers. There were many composers during the Baroque period, and many that we know a lot about. But the 3 major composers that we typically think about when we talk about the Baroque period are Antonio Vivaldi, in Italian, J.S. Bach, who was German and lived his entire life in Germany, and George Frederick Handel, who we'll talk about after we talk about Bach. Handel was born in Germany but lived most of his life in England. So these 3 composers basically represent the major ideas of the Baroque period. You could argue that Bach represented all of them. But we're going to start with Vivaldi, whose music is really a lot of fun to listen to. He's extremely inventive as a composer. He was, like Corelli, first and foremost a violinist. But unlike Corelli, he composed pretty much for every instrument, and he composed a lot of music. In fact, he wrote about 500 concertos alone. So for various instruments, violins, 2 violins, 3 violins, 4 violins. He wrote cello concertos, bassoon concertos, oboe concertos, really almost for every instrument. He wrote some 40 operas. He wrote a lot of sacred music, choral music, pretty much everything. He was extremely productive. Took him very little time to compose. And while it's true not every work was extremely unique, many of his pieces are incredible examples of Baroque architecture and extremely inventive. And we're going to listen to one of those, actually 2 of those pieces today. He spent the majority of his life in Venice, so in the northeast corner of Italy. He was an ordained priest, and because of his fiery red hair, he became known as the Red Priest. And he spent much of his productive life working in what was called the ospedale, which was an orphanage. Basically, they saved young girls from from a life of who knows what, or even from death. They grew up in this convent, and they were trained, and many of them were trained musically by Vivaldi. And they had they were tremendously talented, and developed quite a reputation. This is an image from the ospedale, from the orphanage, of a performance with girls. They performed behind a screen because it was felt immodest that they were entirely visible. And typically, Vivaldi would write the music, and then he would select the girls to perform, depending on what they played, and then they would perform his music with him directing. So this gives you an idea of kind of the scenario in which his music was performed. He also composed, while he composed a lot of what's called absolute music, that is, music that didn't do anything except sound like music, it didn't carry any extra musical content. He composed a lot of program music as well. And that means music that's supposed to describe something other than just being the music. It could describe nature in some ways, storms, bird calls. But we're going to see a lot of examples of that in music history. It could portray states of mind, or whatever. That is, using music to portray something other than what the music itself is. That makes it very interesting to listen to. And his most famous work is something called Four Seasons. And this is a cycle for violin and orchestra. It's a series of concertos. It's actually 4 concertos. Actually, I'm jumping ahead here. Each one depicting a different season. They have the same architecture in each one, which is typical of the Baroque concerto. They're in a fast, slow, fast scheme. And being a violinist and being very inventive, he explores all kinds of different ways to use the instrument to portray elements of nature, whether it's icy cold or heat or bird calls. You're going to hear all examples of these in the Four Seasons. We're going to listen to 2 separate movements from 2 of the concertos. So we're going to start with the first concerto, which is Spring. And we're going to listen to the first movement. So it is just marked allegro, which means fast. And it is set up in ritornello form, which you'll recall is a form where an idea is presented at the beginning, a full-fledged theme or melody, and that is going to recur throughout the course of that movement, interspersed with separate sections, some kind of contrasting material. Frequently, composer will go into a different key or keys. It may be a different theme, a different idea, and then he will come back to the ritornello pretty much exactly like it was at the beginning. In the case of the ritornello of the first concerto here, actually there are some slight deviations of the idea when it comes back, but it's always very recognizable. So it's going to be A, B, A, C, A prime, D, or whatever, back to A, and it will end as it did at the beginning with the same material and in the same key. So it has a pretty clear architecture like that. You should listen for how the violin is used. It's going to, we're going to hear some trills between the violins, that is moving the finger back and forth very quickly. Yeah, 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 that kind of idea, which is supposed to imitate bird calls. We're going to have the orchestra with a kind of flowing pattern, da 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 da, something like that, which is supposed to imitate the murmuring of streams. We're going to have lightning, all kinds of interesting effects. Now, you have to remember, this is a work of probably around 1660 or something like that. So we're not in the modern age of John Williams and big orchestras and lots of sound effects. This is kind of where it all started. I'm going to suggest for these examples, although I'm going to talk you through it while we listen to it, I'm going to suggest that you also listen to these on your own so you can hear the sound unaffected by coming through my computer, okay? And if I can get this one up, it will be great. Okay, sorry, I had to insert a link here that didn't seem to catch before. So I think we are good. Let me screen share. Okay, so this is then from Vivaldi's Spring, the first of his 4 seasons, the first movement, the allegro. And I'll kind of talk you through it as we go. So we have here the concertmaster, that's the first violinist. He is the violinist leading the group, as Vivaldi would have done. There would not have been a conductor yet in the orchestra. It would have been led by the first violinist. And in Vivaldi's case, this all would have been girls. And this is an instrument called a theorbo. It's a kind of a lute, and it acts as part of the continuo family. Okay. All right, so bird calls. And it's kind of an exchange between the first two violinists, although you can't see. There's the other violinist here. Always cutting away to the Norwegian countryside. I guess that's what spring looks like in Norway when the snow thaws. So you can see in this case, there's a harpsichord back here. And for the continual instruments, it would be the harpsichord, the oboe, and would be the first cellist, for example. And you'll hear them at times being singled out, driving the bass line. Okay, that's again part of the ritornello theme. Okay, this is a contrasting idea. I think this is an amazing instrument, the theorbo. You can see how long it is in order to get those deep tones. Again, contrasting ideas. And again, a ritornello idea presented from the beginning. You can hear the cellist by himself here. That's the continual group. Back to the whole group again. Okay, so that is as long as that first movement is. So you can hear that the movements, like with the Corelli, are rather short. So we had a first movement of the Four Seasons in the Spring Concerto in a ritornello form. I don't know if you could hear it, but if you listen, when you listen, I should say, again, you will hear this main idea presented at the beginning coming back successively throughout the movement. Right? That's how the ritornello form works. Okay. The other concerto movement I want to play for you is from Winter. This is the third movement from Winter. And one of the interesting things about the Four Seasons of Vivaldi is he wrote a text to go with the concerto, not to be sung, but it was something that he wrote to kind of inspire the music. And for Winter, this is the text that he left, in translation, of course. We tread the icy path slowly and cautiously for fear of tripping and falling. Then turn abruptly, slip, crash on the ground, and rising, hasten on across the ice, lest it cracks up. We feel the chill north winds course through, we feel the chill north winds course through the home, despite the locked and bolted doors. This is winter, which nonetheless brings its own delights. So the performance I'm going to show you here once again, I thought that I didn't have the link, but it turns out that I do. So this performance is of all women's orchestra. So it gives you a sense maybe of kind of Vivaldi's day. And they are performing on original instruments. So the performance I just showed you was modern instruments, except for the theorbo, I guess, and the harpsichord. But all the string players were playing modern instruments and playing them in modern ways. You're going to see on this performance, the string players are choking up on the bow. So they're holding the bows much further up on the stick. The bow looks slightly different. It's the kind of bow that would have been used in Vivaldi's day. The instruments are going to be tuned slightly lower. and they're trying to recreate what we know of music and how it was performed during the Baroque period. And again, I'm going to talk you through this, but then I want you to listen to it on their own so that you can hear it without my voice and you can hear better sound. So again, led from the concertmaster position. All right. Again, get one cello as the continuo. You can see how she's holding her bow. The bow looks a little bit different than a regular bow. This is a super exciting concerto that takes a while to warm up, but you can hear the kind of stuttering figures in the violins, as if somebody's cold and shivering. Again, continuo, harpsichord, the oboe, and the cello. We actually have a portative organ in this case as well, a small organ with a travel wheel. So you can hear the virtuoso riding through the violin. This, during the Baroque period, also is the rise of the instrumental virtuoso, particularly a violin. Again, the idea of the ice cracking up. Contrasting idea. So kind of a slow intermediate section, then it's going to get blisteringly fast. And again, just virtuoso riding for the violin. As they race home off of the ice. So I had forgotten that there actually were a couple male players in this orchestra. Would not have happened during Vivaldi's day. It would have been either an all-male orchestra or all-female orchestra, and then for Vivaldi at the orphanage, it would have been all-female. So, but quickly, while I've got the performers here lined up. So we've got the concertmaster. That is the first violinist. In this case, it's the soloist and also the leader of the group. Frequently during the Baroque period, performances like this would actually have been led by the harpsichord player if it didn't involve a soloist. So if it was just a work for the entire group, the composer, like Bach or Vivaldi or Handel or whoever it was, probably was also a keyboard player, because that's usually how musicians were trained first. They would have led from the keyboard. But in this case, we have a soloist who's bowing here, obviously, and she is directing the rest of the group. We have the continuo, that is the players that are kind of driving the bass line. So in this case, it was a mixture of these instruments. This is a little bit overdone. In Vivaldi's day, I can't imagine they would have had this many continuo players. But we've got a harpsichord, and we've got a portative organ, and we've got a theorbo. So all three of these instruments are the instruments that would be used to fill out the chords and to play those chords above the bass line. And that bass line would have been played by either the cellist or a bass player. So it's a little bit overdone in this performance, but it helps definitely to fill out the texture. And you can hear the virtuoso writing of the violin. So that's also something that's really important during the Baroque period, is that we have instrumental music, and instrumental music becomes very virtuosic. That is, music for a virtuoso, for a very skilled player. And you can hear from that kind of playing a little bit what Vivaldi was doing. A lot of chords, a lot of rapid string crossings, a lot of rapid scales, creating all kinds of demands for the violinist to kind of show off, which she does beautifully, the soloist in this performance. So those are two movements of the four seasons. And as I said, each of the concertos, and there are four separate seasons and four separate concertos, each has three different movements. But I just picked two, one from spring and one from winter, just to give you an idea of kind of the kinds of things that Vivaldi was doing. So we're going to take a break here, and then I'm going to come back with a video about Johann Sebastian Bach.